In this lecture, we'll focus in on soil properties and plant growth. So, why do we care about soil anyway? The main role that soil plays to the biosphere is to provide an environment for plants to grow. And plants are the basis of the biopyramid. So really, soil is the basis for all life. This slide summarizes the 3 soil properties and our processes related to soils and water. The first is related to how quickly water enters and drains through soils. So soils with larger and more connected pores or openings will allow for faster water infiltration. So if you've ever sat on a beach and you've watched how fast water drains through sand when waves recede from the shoreline, this is because sand has really large connected pores between the sediments. Alternatively, concrete is made up of large sand sediments, but the spaces between these are filled in by cement. And so this prevents water from infiltrating, and instead water will pool on the surface of concrete. Water holding capacity is just what it sounds like. Some soils hold on to water better than others, which in turn provides water for plants so they can take that water up through their roots. However, you don't want the soil to be completely saturated or full of water around the plant's roots because they also need air to respire. So just like animals, plant roots respire instead of photosynthesize. So a good agricultural soil needs to have a good balance of water holding capacity and aeration. Soil scientists often use soil texture to describe a soil, as this influences many different soil properties. Soil texture describes the size of soil sediments and what percent of each size of sediment are represented in the soil. So generally speaking, there are 3 sizes of particles that determine texture, and these are listed on the slide. So there's sand, which are visible particles that are between 2 and 0.063 millimeters in size. Silt is that mid-range of particles, and then clay, you can't see clay particles. They're very, very small. You need a microscope. So it's anything finer than 0.004 millimeters. Anything that's larger than sand, so that would be gravel, cobbles, and boulders, these are not considered to be part of the soil because they're too big to be called sediments. The soil texture is determined by the parent material or rocks that the sediments come from, as well as the degree of weathering that the soil has been subjected to. Soil texture doesn't factor in the amount of organic matter present in that soil. It just looks at the parent material and the sediments in that soil. Very generally speaking, soils with larger particles, so sand, also tend to have larger spaces between the particles, so larger pore spaces. And because of this, sandy soils have better drainage. Alternatively, soils with more clay, so small particles, tend to have a larger fraction of small particles, and they have smaller spaces between the particles. So this allows for more capillary action, like you see in a straw, and so these soils hold on to water better. The image at the top of this slide shows that water rises higher in narrow tubes as compared to wider tubes because they have more cohesive forces. And so this allows the soil with those small pore spaces to hold on to that water better. So to summarize, soils with sand have larger pores and allow for really good aeration, but soils with clay hold on to water that plants need, but they can remain saturated and suffocate plant roots. So the ideal agricultural soil and the ideal soil for plants in general is actually one that has a blend of all 3 soil sediment sizes. So it has sand, silt, and clay. And this type of soil is called a loam. Organic matter is the second big factor in determining the quality of a soil for growing crops and plants in general. So fungi, worms, bacteria, protozoans, insects, burrowing animals, and other creatures break down detritus, which is dead organic matter like leaves that fall onto the surface of the soil. And this leaves behind undecayed residue called humus. The humus accumulates at the top of the O horizon, and as it decays, it then moves down through the O horizon and then accumulates at the top of the A horizon, which is topsoil. Humus has up to 100 times the capacity of clay soil to retain water and nutrients. So the presence of this humus and the organic components is critical for soil health. It also helps to hold soil particles together. When you buy compost or generate compost from your garden, compost is primarily humus. So the amount of organic matter that is decayed and included into the soil column impacts the water holding capacity of the soils, the nutrient holding capacity of soils, the pH of the soils, and more. And thus, this process of decaying detritus is important for us to examine. So in short, the two most important soil factors for plant growth boil down to the amount of organic matter that's in the soil and the amount of clay sediments present. The person in this picture is showing their hand stained with clay and organic matter from soil. Soils that are really high in organic matter and have the correct proportion of clay particles are better at holding on to soil nutrients and water because they have a high surface area to volume ratio and they have the ideal pore size distribution. Of course, there are other soil water issues besides aeration, infiltration, and water holding capacity, and so we'll spend just a few moments discussing these before we end this topic. In arid and warm regions like the deserts in Arizona, the US, and Mexico, water can evaporate from the O horizon in soil before it drains to groundwater, or it can be taken up by plants, which means that these areas have high evaporative water loss. This is a problem for farmers who are trying to grow crops in these hot, dry regions. When the water evaporates, it leaves behind the salts and minerals that were dissolved in the water, and this can cause soils to get salty to the point that new plants can't grow. And this happened in the first human agricultural society in ancient Mesopotamia, which is often referred to as the Fertile Crescent region. So the people began growing a 50-50 split of wheat and barley in this region, but eventually they had to give up on growing wheat because the soils just became too salty to support the growth of the wheat crop. Egypt has experienced similar difficulties in the agricultural regions along the Nile River, and then of course Arizona in the United States also suffers from these problems as well. Finally, do you notice how water pools on the surface of this soil? It's not infiltrating or draining quickly. This soil has been compacted by tractors driving between the rows of soil, and compaction can decrease interconnected pore spaces and infiltration rates of water into the soil.